On my right is Kenneth Roth. Ken is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. He has been here for the last 4 days, meeting with many government officials, NGO activists, victims, survivors of many human rights violations in Indonesia. To my next is Mr. Haris Ashar. Haris is the coordinator, the national coordinator of KontraS, arguably Indonesia's most influential human rights organization. We have known, Human Rights Watch and KontraS have known each other since, I think, since the very first establishment of KontraS. So please, Ken will start the presentation, the talk. After that, Haris will do. Please, Ken.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back in Jakarta. The subject of this morning's press conference is the question of what to do about the 1965 killings. Why do these still matter to today's Indonesia, and how can we properly address them? Obviously, the murder of at least 500,000 people in the course of just a few months is one of the most horrendous crimes of our era, and certainly of Indonesia's history. This is a crime of such a magnitude that it cannot be swept under the rug. Families remember, survivors remember, the descendants remember, and they are bearing a scar, a wound that they want addressed. This is also relevant for today. This is not simply a matter of ancient history. It has relevance because Indonesia remains a society and a country of many divisions. There are religious differences, there are ethnic differences, there are territorial differences. And a big question for Indonesia today is, how does one bridge those differences? 1965 represents a terrible precedent for how to address differences. It represents a precedent of forcing those differences away through mass murder. And sadly, that is a precedent that, because Indonesia has not really addressed it, remains an option, remains a live possibility. And clearly, this is an ugly episode in Indonesia's history which we want never, ever to repeat. But the way to inoculate society against a recurrence of these atrocities is to openly address them, tell the truth about them, acknowledge them, have justice where possible, and then move forward. But trying to forget the past, trying to suppress the past, to censor the past, is the kind of thing that may condemn Indonesia to repeating the past. And we think it's extremely important that a different approach be taken. Now, I should stress that even though I speak here as the representative of an international human rights organization, this is not an international or a foreign demand. This is an Indonesian demand. I have heard in the course of my visit, and my colleague Andreas has heard through many, many years of work here, that the deep desire to address these horrendous crimes is felt passionately and urgently by many Indonesians. Obviously by the survivors, obviously by the families, but also by many ordinary Indonesians who may not have been personally touched by the killings, but who nonetheless want to build a society founded on the truthful acknowledgement of the past and a determination on the basis of knowledge, not forgetting, that we are going to move forward and never repeat that kind of lawlessness. This is a deeply indigenous, a deeply national demand. This has nothing to do with foreign desires. Now, next week, as I think many of you know, the government is hosting a symposium on this topic. That is why, frankly, we are addressing this issue today, even though it is an issue that is now half a century old. This is a very important first step. And I want to acknowledge our recognition that the government is taking a step toward a new approach. It is not repeating the forgetfulness of the past. It is making an initial effort to address the past. And we applaud this important first step by the government. There are several options on the table as to what can be done. I want to begin with one that is clearly not imminent, but is important to recognize nonetheless, and that is the option of justice. When you have crimes of this magnitude, when you have mass murder involving hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, it is important ultimately for the architects of this slaughter to be brought to justice. It's never possible in a situation that involves so many people to bring the day-to-day murderers to account. That's an unfortunate practical reality. I'm also aware that 50 years later, it's not clear how many people are still alive, particularly among the leadership. And this may be a situation like Eastern Europe where the most responsible individuals are no longer alive. So there may be, important practical limits to the justice option, but I want to put that on the table because ideally you do bring to justice the architects, the directors, the people who really oversaw this mass killing. A second goal that will be discussed, I don't think the justice one will be actively discussed at the symposium, but a second one that will actively be discussed is what's been termed rehabilitation. And here the reference is to the 1981 so-called Clean Environment Decree that had been issued by President Suharto. I think, as you all know, this was an effort to cleanse the government bureaucracy, particularly the security forces, of anybody with a family history linked to the PKI. And this is a group of people that has been said to involve some 40 million Indonesians who today are barred from various forms of government employment in the civil service, in the police, and the army. This is obviously a deep injustice. This is a classic example of collective punishment. These are people who have never done anything wrong. They may have had a grandparent or a great-grandparent who allegedly was affiliated with the PKI. Ending this practice of blacklisting these people is obviously an important step, and something that, frankly, the sooner the better. There's no need to have a lengthy process. This is a decree that could be reversed with another decree. And we would like to see that happen, and clearly the organizers of the symposium are interested in this, and that's a good initial step, one that can show a quick action. The more difficult issue comes to the broader questions of how do you address these past atrocities. And there is clearly interest in some kind of an apology, in some kind of compensation, and in a process of reconciliation. Now, those are all good things. The question is, when do they happen? In particular, do they happen before or after a process of telling the truth about the past? And in our view, you can't apologize over a blank slate. You can't reconcile around censorship. You can't be compensated for a closed door. What is needed is to begin with a truth-telling process, to begin with an opportunity for the survivors, perhaps for some of the participants, for the descendants, to speak publicly, to offer their public testimony so that the Indonesian people can hear these first-hand accounts. This kind of public hearing process would lay a factual basis for what we presume would then ultimately be some kind of Truth Commission report. And when that has happened, then it is possible for the government to acknowledge what has happened. Then it's possible for the government to express its sorrow for what happened and to apologize. Then it's possible for the government to compensate the victims or their descendants. Those are meaningful actions on the basis of a factual record. They're not meaningful on the basis of a closed information environment. So we, in assessing the results of the symposium, are going to be looking in particular at whether there is the initiation of a real, meaningful public truth-telling process. That is a sine qua non of an effective accountability process. Now, the final thing I'd like to mention is the role of the United States in this. There clearly are archives in the US government's records about what happened in 1965. There's been some, policy-level disclosures of, broad public statements, but that's not what we're really interested in. We want to know, the working-level involvement between the US government and the killers in 1965. Who knew what? What were the channels of communication? Were there names conveyed by the US government to the Indonesian government? And if so, what happened to those people? It's this kind of operational detail, the cables, the diplomatic messages, the CIA messages. That's what it would be very useful to know as part of the effort to tell the history of 1965. This is not a substitute for an Indonesian process. This is really just one part of a broader picture. But nonetheless, we feel that the US government could constructively contribute to a truth-telling process by opening up its archives and releasing to the public whatever communications exist there. Now, this is something that the US government has done in other cases, so far always in Latin America. President Obama himself has opened up the archives with respect to the so-called dirty wars that took place in Brazil and Argentina. His predecessors as president, have opened the archives with respect to Chile, El Salvador, and Guatemala. These have been very useful contributions to truth-telling processes in those countries. Now, what seems to be a kind of a practical or a political prerequisite to the US doing this, to the president being able to overcome the expectable bureaucratic resistance, particularly in the CIA, to opening up the archives, is that there needs to be a formal request from the government in question and a meaningful truth-telling process. Now, in the case of Indonesia, Komnas HAM has made that request. And that's a very important thing that has happened. In our meetings with the government, we have urged the government itself to add its voice, requesting that the US government open its archives. Similarly, we hope that the symposium launches a process that will enable the US government to see that there is a real truth-telling process underway in Indonesia, and that the release of the US archives would make a contribution to an ongoing, sincere, genuine truth-telling process. If that happens, if there really is a clear Indonesian government request, and if it is pursuant to a truth-telling process, we are confident that President Obama will do the right thing and open up the archives, as he has done in other cases. We realize that there is resistance, and that the Army, the NU, are not eager for a truth-telling process to go forward. And frankly, this is where Indonesian civil society has a role to play. The more the press clamors for a truth-telling process, the more civil society joins in, the more that President Jokowi is going to have the political backing needed to overcome this resistance and to move forward, both in telling the truth here in Indonesia and also requesting the assistance of the US government and others to open up their archives and to contribute their part of the historical record. So we see next week as the beginning of what we hope is a historic moment, an effort to really come to terms with this ugly period of Indonesia's past and to move forward in a way that no longer sweeps this matter under the rug, but reveals as fully as possible what happened, acknowledges it, and builds a foundation of the rule of law so that there is a much lesser chance that Indonesia will ever repeat this terrible period in its past. Thank you very much, and I turn it over to my colleague.
Saya hanya membantu mensummarikan. Jadi ada 5 poin tadi disampaikan oleh Ken Roth. Pertanyaan pertama adalah apa yang harus dilakukan terhadap pembantaian massal tahun 65. Tentu setidaknya 500.000 orang dibunuh pada tahun 65. Bagaimana mengatasi ini? Karena Indonesia negara yang beragam, bineka. Kalau penyelesaian perbedaan itu diselesaikan dengan presiden ala 65, suku, agama, dan seterusnya, tentu ia contoh yang buruk sekali, presiden yang buruk sekali. Jadi apa yang harus dilakukan terhadap 65? Nah, Ken tadi menyebut juga tanggal 18 dan 19 April ini, minggu depan, akan ada simposium dilakukan oleh beberapa lembaga, dipelopori oleh Komnas HAM dan kantor One Team Press, Dewan Pertimbangan Presiden, selama 2 hari, berbagai macam panel membicarakan soal 65. Simposium itu cukup banyak bicara soal rehabilitasi, jadi memberikan ganti rugi kepada korban. Tetapi rehabilitasi saja tidak cukup, karena kita tidak bisa meminta maaf atas sesuatu yang tidak jelas. Ya. Ada misalnya keputusan Presiden tahun 1981, Presiden Soeharto, di mana dikatakan bahwa pegawai negeri, polisi, tentara itu harus bersih lingkungan, belum pernah dicabut. Jadi dampaknya terhadap mereka maupun terhadap anak-anak mereka dan sekarang cucu-cucu mereka, mungkin ada cicit-cicitnya, itu diperkirakan sekitar 40 juta orang. Presiden pemerintah Indonesia bisa dengan mudah mengeluarkan kepres baru untuk membatalkan kepres tahun 81 tersebut. Itu poin ketiga. Poin keempat adalah kebenaran. Jadi rekonsiliasi dan kebenaran itu ibarat mata uang, dua sisi dari mata uang yang sama, koin yang sama. Jadi perlu ada kesempatan buat para korban bicara secara terbuka. Perlu ada kesempatan buat para korban untuk didengarkan suaranya. Jadi ini hal yang tidak bisa lepas dari rekonsiliasi. Nah, poin terakhir yang disampaikan Ken adalah peranan pemerintah Amerika Serikat. Jadi 30 tahun setelah 65 ada cukup banyak kabel dari US Embassy ke Washington yang sudah dibuka. Tetapi masih banyak hal yang belum diketahui. Nah, pemerintah Amerika Serikat tahu, mungkin juga kita nggak tahu apa yang diketahui mereka. Tetapi pasti ada dokumen-dokumen di dalam record pemerintah Amerika Serikat. Ini yang diminta oleh Komnas HAM bulan lalu dalam surat kepada Presiden Barack Obama agar dibuka. Dokumen dari Amerika Serikat ini bukan pengganti dari upaya pemerintah Indonesia untuk menyelesaikan 65. Dia bukan pengganti, dia hanya ikut memberikan kontribusi terhadap penyelesaian masa lalu ini. Seperti halnya Amerika Serikat pernah membuka dokumen-dokumen seluruhnya di Amerika Latin, khusus di bawah Presiden Barack Obama, negara Argentina dan negara Brasil, apa yang disebut dirty war, perang kotor yang dilakukan oleh junta militer di Brasil dan Argentina. Pendahulu Presiden Obama pernah membuka dokumen di Chile, Presiden Salvador Allende, El Salvador, dan Guatemala. Kami minta agar simposium 18-19 April nanti itu ikut mendukung permintaan Komnas HAM agar dokumen-dokumen di Washington DC itu dibuka. Dan tentu kami juga sudah menyampaikan ke berbagai pejabat pemerintah Indonesia yang kami temui selama 3 hari terakhir ini, agar pemerintahan Presiden Jokowi ikut memberikan dukungan agar dokumen ini diminta kepada Presiden Amerika Serikat. Kalau pemerintah meminta, saya percaya Presiden Barack Obama akan membukanya. Jadi kalau ini semua dijalankan, minggu depan adalah sebuah permulaan momen yang bersejarah dalam sejarah Indonesia.
Baik, terima kasih. Thank you, Andreas. And also thank you to Human Rights Watch for this event. I think this is a great event in the right time, in a very contextual moment. but I'm sorry, allow me to use my luxuries to speak in Bahasa, since we have a translator here. And also it will give me more opportunity to make some expressions in a correct way, since this issue is very sensitive to be taken by large people of Indonesians. Terima kasih sekali lagi. Selamat pagi Bu Bapak sekalian. Sekali lagi saya mau mengucapkan terima kasih juga buat Human Rights Watch buat kegiatan atau event pagi ini, press conference yang terkait dengan isu rekonsiliasi soal 65 yang memang sedang dalam pembahasan setidak-tidaknya pada sejumlah kalangan di pemerintahan. Ada beberapa poin yang ingin saya sampaikan untuk memperkaya dan juga memberikan perspektif lain selain apa yang sudah disampaikan oleh Bapak Ken Roth. Pertama, saya ingin menyampaikan bahwa dalam 18 tahun, hampir 18 tahun transisi politik di Indonesia sejak tahun 98, ada sejumlah kemajuan untuk pemulihan hak-hak korban peristiwa 65, 66 dan seterusnya. Ada misalnya pembebasan para tahanan politik dari peristiwa 65, 66. Lalu ada perubahan peraturan perundang-undangan yang memberikan hak politik terhadap orang-orang yang pernah distigma sebagai korban 65. Lalu juga ada putusan pengadilan terutama dari Mahkamah Agung setelah diajukan judicial review yang memberikan hak atau setidaknya memerintahkan kepada pemerintah untuk mencabut sejumlah peraturan-peraturan yang memberikan menjamin diskriminasi. Itu tapi tidak dilakukan hingga hari ini. Saya sampai di situ saya ingin mengatakan pengalaman KontraS berinteraksi mengadvokasi sejumlah korban dari peristiwa 65-66 itu memberikan pembelajaran bahwa mereka betul sudah dibebaskan, tapi mereka belum mendapatkan kebebasan. Jadi dibebaskan tanpa kebebasan. Ini salah satu ekspresi dan ini terbukti, terverifikasi dari sebuah daftar peraturan perundang-undangan di level kementerian yang mencantumkan bahwa mereka masih dilarang misalnya untuk mendapatkan hak-hak pensiun mereka yang dulu sebagai pegawai negeri, atau pelarangan-pelarangan untuk menjadi pegawai dan lain sebagainya. Bapak Ibu sekalian, poin berikutnya yang ingin saya sampaikan adalah peristiwa 65-66 itu sendiri. Peristiwa itu adalah peristiwa, singkatnya saya ingin katakan, peristiwa yang memutarbalikkan semua bangunan sosial politik di Indonesia. Ada satu platform politik yang baru, di mana militer itu menjadi dominan selama pemerintahan Orde Baru dalam kurun waktu yang sangat lama dan masuk ke sejumlah sektor yang hampir tidak tersisa untuk ruang kelompok-kelompok pro-demokrasi. Selama lebih dari 30 tahun, ada upaya-upaya yang kita sebut hari ini sebagai korupsi, memperkaya diri sendiri, memperkaya kelompoknya sendiri untuk pembiayaan politik grupnya sendiri atau kelompoknya sendiri. Ada gap yang sangat serius dalam logika publik melihat demokrasi dibandingkan dengan kemampuan dan akses-akses para politisi, para penguasa dari zaman Orde Baru. Semua dikontrol, semua dikuasai, yang berbeda itu direpresi. Nah, situasi ini sebetulnya yang ingin saya sampaikan bahwa peristiwa 65-66 itu bukan saja terjadi pada tahun 65 dan 66. Bahwa dampak buruk dari peristiwa tersebut adalah pembenaran sepihak dan mengorbankan jutaan orang lainnya di tahun-tahun berikutnya. Politik Orde Baru mengorbankan menciptakan berbagai peristiwa ikutan terhadap mahasiswa di era tahun 70-an, tahun 80-an hingga akhir 90-an sampai melakukan penculikan, penghilangan orang, dan disitulah kantor KontraS berdiri. Momentum ini yang harusnya dilihat, jadi sebagai catatan terhadap simposium, apakah simposium ini hanya akan melihat pada tahunnya saja di peristiwa 65-66, atau melihat sampai ekstensifikasi kejahatan dari satu paradigma politik yang buruk. Dan itu yang akhirnya tidak terkoreksi hingga hari ini. Kita melihat bagaimana juga sebagaimana yang dibuktikan oleh Human Rights Watch dalam laporan misalnya soal kekerasan terhadap kelompok minoritas dengan mengedepankan praktek-praktek intoleransi. Bagaimana misalnya pengusiran, persekusi dilakukan. Ini semua adalah praktek-praktek yang dibangun, dipelajari, di-exercise sejak tahun 65, 66 hingga hari ini. Jadi kepentingan negara menyelesaikan peristiwa 65 adalah dalam rangka mengkoreksi ideologi kekerasan, dalam rangka mengkoreksi paradigma pemerintahan yang menempatkan rakyat, setiap individu maupun secara bersama-sama sebagai objek, bukan sebagai subjek. Tidak ada ruang partisipasi. Nah, ini pula yang sebetulnya menjadi persoalan mendasar. Yang berikutnya saya ingin menyampaikan, betul bahwa di kalangan masyarakat masih terpelihara dengan sangat kuat melihat bahwa peristiwa 65 adalah sesuatu yang perlu dinistakan. Diskriminasi dan stigma itu masih terjadi terhadap korban-korban 65. Mereka masih menganggap bahwa mereka adalah PKI, komunis yang harus terus dicampakkan. Saya pikir ini tugas negara untuk mendidik. Oleh karenanya saya setuju dengan apa yang disampaikan oleh Roth, bahwa yang namanya truth, kebenaran itu harus diungkapkan, harus dibuka seterang-terangnya. Tidak boleh satu kebenaran mendominasi. Semua harus dihadirkan secara seimbang. Ada dari versi militer, ada versinya korban yang banyak tidak didengar, harus diungkapkan juga secara proporsional. Dan dia saling melengkapi. Biarkan publik dan generasi demi generasi ke depan yang akan menafsirkan lebih jauh seperti apa truth itu harus dilihat. Tetapi juga yang penting buat para korban, spesifik yang haknya diambil adalah soal bagaimana memulihkan harga diri mereka. Hari ini kita melihat korban 65, kita selalu dapat kabar setiap minggu ada yang meninggal. Mereka tambah tua. Mereka menua, menjadi tua dan meninggal dalam sebuah situasi yang tidak ada penghargaan terhadap mereka dari negara. Tidak ada rasa penyesalan. Tidak ada koreksi. Saya pikir satu sikap yang tegas dari negara dibutuhkan hari ini terhadap korban 65, bagaimana mereka harus dipulihkan hak-haknya. Sampai di situ saya mau mengatakan support saya terhadap simposium jika ada pembahasan soal rehabilitasi. Tetapi juga kami ingat beberapa tahun yang lalu, KontraS dan beberapa lembaga yang lainnya bersama keluarga korban dan korban berhasil mendesak Komnas HAM untuk melakukan penyelidikan. Untuk itu berkas ini secara hukum juga perlu diuji untuk terus dijalankan ke proses hukum yang lebih tinggi. Terakhir, saya ingin mengatakan bahwa terkait dengan simposium, saya sampai tadi malam dapat update terkait dengan kerangka acuan atau term of reference yang akan dijadikan sebagai acuan untuk penyelenggaraan simposium kemungkinan minggu depan. Dari TOR itu ternyata jelas bahwa simposium hanya akan dilakukan hanya untuk peristiwa 6566. Dan besar kemungkinan pembicaraan dilakukan pada sektor historis. Bagaimana melihat dampak historis, psikologis, situasi politik. Hanya ada satu sesi yang membahas soal bagaimana upaya penyelesaian pelanggaran HAM, yaitu di sesi terakhir. Di TOR tersebut saya tidak bisa melihat ada kata-kata janji negara untuk membangun kebijakan bagaimana menyelesaikan pelanggaran HAM tersebut ke depannya. Sampai di sini catatan kritis saya bisa banyak, tapi satu yang ingin saya sampaikan, simposium itu hanya akan melihat peristiwa 65-66, tidak pada peristiwa-peristiwa ikutan yang terjadi akibat dari ideologi kekerasan, kebijakan militeristik, dan juga praktek-praktek brutalitas yang banyak terjadi di Aceh, di Papua, di Timor Leste, dan beberapa kasus seperti Talang Sari, penculikan orang hilang, dan lain-lain. Mungkin itu pengantar dari saya untuk kita mungkin bisa tanya jawab dan diskusi lebih jauh. Terima kasih banyak.
Hi, this is Chris from Bloomberg. this is a question to Ken. Have you met anyone from the government in relation to this symposium, and what sort of message are you receiving? Do you think there is a real desire to do this, because this presumably will involve quite a lot of political capital on behalf of the president?
Yes. We did meet with both Mr. Siddharto, who is, I guess the principal architect among the presidential advisors of the symposium, and we met with the president's chief of staff. And I think it's safe to say that there is recognition on the one hand that truth is an essential prerequisite for any meaningful reconciliation process. Nobody really quarrels with that fact. At the same time, there's recognition that there is serious resistance within certain elements of both the government and society to a serious truth-telling process. And I don't yet know where the president comes out on this. And clearly it is going to be a matter of presidential intervention as to how far the process launched by this symposium goes. And so, part of why I think it's important that this be a matter of genuine public debate within Indonesia is so that the president hears the desire of the Indonesian people for a real accountability process, for a real truth-telling, and not just some superficial seminar reviewing the past. Having a bunch of academics talk about the past is not the same thing as a truth-telling process. Truth-telling processes require victim, perpetrator, survivor testimony. It's that kind of personalized rendering of the past that makes a truth-telling process meaningful and genuine. So that's what we're looking for. I don't yet know how it's going to come out. And I don't think anybody knows except the president, as he's kind of in his own mind debating how to go forward.
Hi, my name is Virya. I'm from Jakarta Post. Is it possible to entirely solve this 1965 case when lots of people allege as the perpetrators of this case are still ruling the country now? And what is an ideal way to erase the stigma and the discrimination in the public and the society on the grassroots levels? Thank you.
Well, I think it's an open question how many people who were actively involved in 1965 are still in positions of authority, because this was 50 years ago. And it's unfortunate that we've waited this long. It obviously would have been better to have an accountability process begun much earlier, when people would be more in their prime. They may well have been in positions of power. But I think if I could reinterpret your question a little bit, there are elements of society and government today that feel that they benefited from 1965 and are reluctant to re-examine 1965 for fear of jeopardizing their institutions and their positions of power. So even though people may not have been, the killers in 1965, if they feel that they were that they benefited from what happened, if they were beneficiaries of that, they're reluctant to re-examine that moment of history. And that's really the challenge. I don't deny the existence of significant reactionary forces here. There are clearly elements of the government and society that want to keep the door closed, that want the truth to continue to be swept under the rug. And the only way to overcome that is, through presidential leadership and through public support for the president as he attempts to deal with those who want to keep the past in the closet. So that, I think, is the challenge. And I don't pretend that that's easy, but it is absolutely important. It is essential if Indonesia is really to learn from the past and to build a democracy that is based on the rule of law and that treats these kinds of atrocities as something that is absolutely unacceptable as a way of addressing the differences that do exist within Indonesian society.
Kit Lam of The Guardian.
Haris, before the election of President Jokowi, there was a lot of hope, particularly from the human rights community, that he would work to address past violations such as 1965. How hopeful are you, more than a year on, when Jokowi's been very silent on a lot of important issues, that real progress really will be made on 1965?
It's pretty disappointed. in 2014, we were approached by the team of the Jokowi campaign, and we put on the table several issues. One of it was on how to have a presidential commission, on how to mitigate to bridging up between the Komnas HAM, the National Human Rights Commissions, to the Attorney General Office, in order to enhance several dossiers of the human rights violation cases. And I think our proposal was adopted, not 100%, but I think it was pretty satisfied on how to see they put the wordings in that promising document that came up from the Jokowi's campaign team. After he was elected, I managed to talk to several persons from his government or his political cycle. However, this approach or talk is only a talk at the end, and these days is, as we can see, is the effort that they try to do to respond of that promises that they have. So I would say this is a very disappointed, because the symposium that we will have next week is only, this is not only, I shouldn't put word only, but this will talk the 65, 66 mass killing. At the moment, we have a huge impact from what was happened in after 65. The student shooting cases, disappearances, martial law in Aceh, 4,000 people were victimized. We can see how bad is Papua until today, and also the intolerance group being victimized up to now as well. So I think, yeah, to make it short, I just would like to say that nothing is really significant came from Jokowi as a president, and also nothing is impressive came from his government or his cabinet on how to address. To add a little point in this regard, I just would like to make a statement as well that he has a very unsupportive Attorney General in his government, who support the death penalty, the execution of death penalty, under the banner of law enforcement. But when he talked about the past abuses, which related to some big names from the military, he always said, we losing out the evidence. Andrea said he just afraid, which I support this statement. In fact, that is the real cause. So in this regard, I think KontraS would like to take an initiative on how to showing up again to the public that we have this long list of witnesses and long list of evidence, and I think we will challenge his office, the Attorney General office, on how he made this kind of double standard. Thank you. I hope that gives you some answer.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Before we finish, because it is almost 12, Haris asked me to summarize his 4-point statement in English. One, Haris said that it's been 18 years after the fall of President Suharto, 1998. And over the last 18 years, there are some progress. One is all 1965 political prisoners were released under President Habibie then. There is also another progress that they can vote. In the past, former political prisoners cannot vote. Their rights have already been rehabilitated. Supreme Court also canceled a ministerial decree which says that those former political prisoners cannot receive their pension if they were civil servants. So there are progress. The thing is, in Bahasa Indonesia, Harris said that mereka sudah dibebaskan. They have already been freed. Tapi belum mendapat kebebasan. But not yet to get their freedom. They have already been freed, sudah dibebaskan, tapi belum mendapat kebebasan, but not getting their freedom yet. Point number 2. 1965 is not only about 1965. It turned over the political and social structure of Indonesia as a state. The military obviously went into almost all sector of the society, and of course the room for democracy, civil liberties became so much narrow. It also created the culture of corruption, not only for individual but also for groups. Harris also said that 1965 grew violence after violence. After 1965, there was a violence in Kalimantan against ethnic Chinese, and in the 1970s, more violence. East Timor invaded 1975. Papua until now is still very bad. Aceh, etc., etc. Now sectarian violence, religious violence. It was the mother of all violence in Indonesia. Point number 3. People are still stigmatizing those who were involved or communism, etc., etc., and there should be a public education regarding 1965. The government should be strict in educating, should be firm in educating the public about 1965. Point number 4, regarding the symposium. Last night, Harris received the term of reference of the symposium next week. Unfortunately, it is only about 1965-1966 killing. There is only one session of the 2-day event, which will talk about how to solve 1965 problem. The symposium, unfortunately, still does not touch about the impact of 1965-1966. That's all. Yes. Now, thank you so much. Have a good day.